Shalom. Let's study from Parshat Re'eh with Ramban, with Nachmanides' commentary, as we have been doing all year at Congregation Or Zarua. Nachmanides is our Parshan Hashanah, our commentator of the year, and we're in chapter 13 of Deuteronomy. Et kol hadavar asher anochi mitzaveh etchem oto tishmeru lasot. This chapter begins, and the Torah says, the entire word I command you. Very interesting choice for the word of Torah being called the word, the words of Torah, the commandments of Torah, the laws and obligations of Torah being called the word. We know the power of words, and we know the power of using them for teaching and for responding and for defining how we both feel and think about Torah in our lives. So all of it, make sure you do it, lasot, lo tosef alav v'lo tigra mimenu. You shall not add to it, and you shall not subtract to it. So right away we're left with a question. If every generation has a unique experience, and Torah is made for every generation, how can it be that we don't add to it? I mean, take using computers and electronics. Some rabbis in the conservative movement say, kosher if it's set up before Shabbat and left running 25 hours, and a non-Jewish soul actually controls the dashboard, and you live stream and you're not playing with the dials and the buttons and adjusting the brightness. Some rabbis say there's no way that halachically we can permit this. There's writing yourself into the digital world, that's ketiva, that's writing on Shabbat. There is the use of the electronics themselves. There are not devices that don't require us to manipulate the fixtures and all kinds of switches. So we know that not only are there going to be additions, but there are going to be debates about what can be added and what isn't added. And some communities will say one way and some communities will hold another. And that is how the Ramban, Nachmanides, is going to read this chapter, not about the foreign prophet or the idol worshiper who tries to tell you what God might want from you when there's a chidush, a new way of seeing Torah. But Ramban is going to see this as an internal discussion among the Jewish people ourselves. What happens when there's an assertion that a legitimate way of doing Jewish comes through the name of God, comes as a way of sanctifying God and what God really demands of us if we are keepers of the Torah? And when do we follow and when do we not? So he'll see that in the narrative, even though it says, if there should stand up in your midst a prophet or a dreamer of a dream, and he will produce to you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes about of which he spoke to you, saying, let us follow other gods that you do not know, and we shall worship them, that perhaps what he's talking about is a refinement or a new way of seeing an existing Jewish law, or a new rule or a new way of engaging in living Torah. And verse 4 says, do not hearken to the words of that prophet or to that dreamer of a dream. For Hashem your God is testing you to know whether you love Hashem your God with all your heart and with all your soul. A familiar phrase to us because of the Shema. Now, if we only took the beginning of verse 4, Lo tishma el divrei hanavi hahu. Don't listen to that prophet, to that, let's say the prophet is a stand-in word for sage, or that authority who rules in a new light when it comes to the way of keeping Torah, because he sees that we have the need for such a new way to move Torah along and respect God and our tradition and worship God through this new way. We don't listen to his words, but that's not the whole of it. God is testing us to say, is it really connected to godliness? And that, for the Ramban, is the question that refines, I think he's saying, it's the question that refines any new approach to Jewish tradition and what God might demand of us. The best we can do is come together with minds, hearts, and souls and really make that distinction. Is this just our desire, a new way that we want to practice, a new vision that we have, a dream that we have in the middle of the night? Or is it a truly godly path forward that respects all of Torah, all the words of Torah, the teachings of Torah, and the generations of interpretation of the Torah, especially by our forefathers, foremothers, the prophets themselves? Ramban will use the moment in time that the Megillah was set into motion as the text to read on Purim. And he'll say, seems to me that if someone prophesies in the name of God or uses the sense that this is a godly way forward to create a commandment, a new commandment, as it was at the time that the Megillah was commanded to the Jewish people, because remember, that's not in the Torah. The Megillah reading is not a commandment from the Torah. She'eino chayav mitah. With that mitzvah, even though it was new, there is no liability to the death penalty. It is not false prophecy. It is not falsifying words of Torah. If that commandment is indeed established by the sages in that case as a way of sanctifying God's name and further unifying the Jewish people. For all the Jewish people agreed and acceded to the covenantal agreement at that time at Purim to reestablish a Torah-based peoplehood, even within the context of the diaspora that they were living in. So there's not a false prophecy or a false interpretation of the way to move Torah and the Jewish understanding of God's will forward. What do we have to be careful about? How far can we push it? What are the boundaries for our creative interpretation? When are we willing to say that we are either adding too much or taking too much away? These are the central issues in the first part of chapter 13 of Deuteronomy. And the Ramban highlights one other occasion where Elijah, the prophet, had to fight Baal worshippers, idol worshippers, and had to, for a limited number of days, allow sacrifices outside the temple, even though the centrality of worship is so important in our tradition, and Jerusalem will be established as the central place. Elijah had to permit sacrifices outside the temple. But Ramban is quick to say, Anu chayavim lishmoa elav v'lasot kol asher yitzavenu. We have to do what he commanded, and we are able to do what he commanded in the name of God. But aval im yatir zeh liktsat hayamim lahora'at sha'ah. That's when we listen. If he commanded it only for a limited amount of time, a limited number of days, such a radical departure from normative Judaism inherited from the generations before him, such a departure can only be for a certain number of days, or else you do not listen to him. It's not prophetic to totally uproot traditions that have lasted for thousands and thousands of years, or 1,000 years before that. What is important and essential is that it might mean a day or two, 3, of changing the way that you approach the whole question of sacrifices in the temple, for instance, or a way that you keep Shabbat in our generation. But more than a couple of days' time, careful, the Ramban says, you don't want to uproot the Torah, add too much, take away too much from the central sacred experiences that define Torah living for the Jewish people. Shabbat Shalom.